It's almost time, kids. The clock is ticking. Tune into YouTube for the review. And remember, there's no giveaway because I'm a part-time YouTuber with a full-time job. But the clock is still ticking. You can still wear your mask if you want. It's almost time.
Happy, happy Halloween, 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 happy, happy Halloween, Silver Shamrock.
I can't believe this. I can't tell you anything. Every time I tell you something, everybody else knows about it.
What is up, everyone? It's Brandon coming at you live from Smith's Grove, and today we're covering a movie that's perfect for a retrospective review. Why? Because this movie in particular didn't gain its following until much later in its life. Halloween 3 was released in 1982, and it was written and directed by Tommy Lee Wallace. Now, Tommy Lee Wallace himself would say that's a phony credit, because science fiction writer Nigel Neal actually wrote the original screenplay for the film, and about 60% or so of the screenplay actually made it into the final version of the film. After the producers ordered more violence and gore, the screenplay was altered by John Carpenter and again later by Tommy Lee Wallace. Being displeased with the alterations, Neal supposedly requested his name be removed from the credits, thus giving his sole credit to Wallace. The intentions of the crew after Halloween 2 was to create an anthology series similar to The Twilight Zone, where each new movie would have a different story, but be focused around the holiday of Halloween. Drawing inspirations from Invasion of the Body Snatchers, Wallace refers this film to being more of, quote, a pod movie instead of a knife movie. Pretty much the entire crew from Halloween 2 is back for this one, with the exception of a new on-screen cast. Dean Cundey is back as cinematographer, and John Carpenter and Alan Howarth return for the score of the film. Lead roles include Carpenter alumni and OG pimp Tom Atkins, who plays Dr. Dan Chalice, hottie Stacey Nelkin as Ellie Grimbridge, and Dan O'Herlihy as the legendary movie villain Connell Cochran. With a budget of $2.5 million, Halloween 3 was released in the fall of '82 and grossed a total of $14.4 million in the US. While that's not a bad return, it was still the worst performing Halloween movie, and when compared to other horror movies released that year, like Poltergeist that made over $76 million, and Friday the 13th Part 3 that made over $34 million, it just couldn't quite hold a candle. The real issue here, though, was the obvious lack of due diligence on behalf of the crew and producers for not relaying the premise of Halloween 3 to the audience in a clear way. Still, using the Halloween name and calling it a Part 3 was probably not the wisest decision. Also, not realizing at the time how big Michael Myers was to the franchise was another oversight. That said, what they set out to do was not a bad idea in any way. There just wasn't a lot of foresight used when trying to move away from the roots of Michael Myers. I often question if calling it Season of the Witch would have helped the movie earlier on, but I also wonder if it didn't have the Halloween name or budget, would we still actually be talking about it today? It truly is a charming, one-of-a-kind movie, but it's still hard to say if it would have been better off. Fortunately for Wallace and the crew, the film has had a huge turnaround the last decade or so and has really gained a huge following now that everyone has gotten over themselves and boycotting the movie for not having Myers in it. So what makes this red-headed stepchild of the Halloween franchise stand out now? Let's take a look inside the Sanitarium at Halloween 3, Season of the Witch. After an old-school computer-generated opening with a kick-ass theme, the movie begins in Northern California 8 days before Halloween. Yep, this is going to be an adventure. An old man named Harry Grimbridge is running away from an oncoming car, taking refuge in what looks to be a junkyard or body shop lot. While hiding, he runs into what looks like a vacuum salesman who immediately grabs Harry and starts choking him. Harry managed to pull the block out from a car and crushes the dude with a painfully slow-moving car. That's what you get for that haircut, bro. What is that? Harry takes off into the night, and because this movie really likes to needlessly tell us where we're at in the movie, another card tells us it's 1 hour later, where a gas station attendant is watching a report of how a piece of Stonehenge was stolen. It's a bit of foreshadowing here that you completely forget about until the end because everything else going on in this movie. A commercial break gives us our first taste of the equally catchy and annoying jingle from Silver Shamrock novelties that we're going to be hearing a lot in this movie.
Halloween, Halloween, 8 days to Halloween, Silver Shamrock.
The iconic theme here is an altered version of London Bridge is Falling Down that features Tommy Lee Wallace with smooth voiceovers and took around a week to finish. Take advantage of that public domain, bitches! Harry shows up and grabs the attendant before passing out with one of the Silver Shamrock masks in his hands. The Halloween 3 masks were a collaboration with Don Post Studios, which already designed the Skull and Witch masks, so they were already made, and the pumpkin mask being made specifically for this movie. We finally meet our everyday man's man, alcoholic, and pimp daddy Dr. Dan Chalice, played by Tom Atkins. It's here that we find he has 2 bratty kids that already have those terrible looking masks because his ex-wife Linda, played by Nancy Kyes, already bought them. Dan gets called into work when the friendly neighborhood gas attendant brings in Harry. Realizing he's black in a horror movie, he decides to take off rather quickly because he doesn't want any part of this white people shit. After hearing the jingle, Harry comes to and gives Chalice his creepy warning.
They're going to kill us.
Here's what Dan thinks of that warning, Harry. After passing out on the couch in his office, another suited thug with better hair this time shows up to finish Harry off with an absolute brutal kill. After hearing the nurse scream, Dan wakes up and runs outside to a creepy visual of the suited man dousing himself with gasoline in an overly calm way and lights himself on fire. Being a movie, the car explodes immediately in ridiculous fashion, but still is a nice visual. Already you're starting to see this movie's very different from what we've seen before. Another card tells us it's the next day with Ellie, Harry's daughter, showing up to identify the body. And almost immediately after that, we're sent another 3 days in the future by another title card with Dan the man getting his swerve on with Teddy the coroner, trying to figure out what came from that strange man in the car explosion. Fast forward another 2 days by another title card. Dan is drinking it up in the bar where we get another teaser ad for the OG Halloween, followed by another ad for the Silver Shamrock giveaway. No shortage of this jingle in this movie, I promise you. Dan is annoyed, as we all are at this point, and tells the bartender to turn that shit off. Ellie tracks down Dan in the bar with the help of his trusty staff, who tell her he's an absolute lush, apparently. Oddly enough, she enlists Dan to help figure out what happened to her father instead of, calling a police officer or detective. Dan, being curious himself, agrees because, look at her. Why wouldn't you? They head to Harry's toy shop where they find a record of the last thing that he did was pick up some masks from the Silver Shamrock factory in Santa Mira. Dan grabs a 6-pack of brewskis and calls his ex-wife to cancel plans with his kids so he can sexcapade with Ellie instead. Classic Dan. Fun fact here, this is actually the same street used here in Halloween 2, where Boombox Boy runs into Michael Myers and Karen was taking her friend home. Also down the street from that corner stands the church that was used in The Fog. I love that the crew uses the same locations in all these films. It's just kind of nice. You keep it close. A new location, however, used is in Lolita, California, standing in as the fictional Santa Mira, California in this movie. Dan and Ellie arrive in Santa Mira, and right away you get a very closed-off, creepy feeling. You can spot nosy locals and CCTV cameras as they drive through town. They pose as a married couple and rent a motel room. After they arrive, they meet Shamrock salesman Buddy Kupfer, his wife Betty, and their dumb shit ginger son Buddy Jr. Also staying there is another salesperson, Marge Gutman. She's less enthused to be there, however. Back in the motel room, Ellie is gung-ho about heading to the factory straight away. Dan, however, has had a long day without the drink. Deciding he needs a drink right now, he suggests they take their time. He suggests they get separate rooms, though, just to be polite, and she says it would look pretty suspicious because they're supposed to be married. It's here we get some of the best Skinamax dialogue ever.
Where do you want to sleep, Dr. Chalice?
That's a dumb question, Miss Grimbridge.
As the sun sets, we get a loudspeaker over the town voiced by an uncredited Jamie Lee Curtis here, where she's reminding everyone of the town curfew. Everyone shuts themselves in, but not Dan. No, Dan has important shit to do, like visit the local liquor store that the curfew apparently doesn't apply to. On his way back, he cuts down an alley where he runs into a homeless guy who coaxes Chalice into a drink. We get a little exposition from the homeless guy about Karl Cochran and his empire when he decides to scream at the clouds in disgust.
Oh, he's laughing now!
After separating, the homeless man gets attacked by more suited up men who, by this point, we know work for Cochran. Dick the Warlock has traded in his Michael Myers cosplay from Halloween 2 and has become Dick the Enforcer, ripping the homeless guy's head off in another nice kill. This movie doesn't pull a lot of punches on the kills, for the most part, and I really appreciate that. Back at the motel, Ellie, clearly having some daddy issues, having packed some sexy lingerie, starts getting her freak on with Dr. Dan. Dan goes in for the checkup here in a surprisingly long, milky scene. It's good to see Dan taking a break from the booze. During some post-coital cuddles, our favorite commercial comes on the radio. Dan isn't amused, but it seems to get Ellie excited again. Dan asks if she's the least bit tired, forgetting she's 23 and he's 47. While attempting another round, Marge Gutman is in the next room. She finds a loose Silver Shamrock tag and does what any reasonable person would do, and that's pick at the chip with a bobby pin. Her tampering sparks a blue beam of light that shoots into her mouth, completely mutilating her face in another awesome and grotesque kill. The twitching and bug crawling out here was a really disgusting nice touch. Man, that's awesome. Ellie hears that something is off, but Dan has got his groove back, so he doesn't really give a shit right this second. They come to find out about Marge's little accident and are informed by Karl Cochran that she'll be taken care of at the factory because apparently that's where medical attention is received in this small town.
What happened?
Misfire.
There's nothing sus about this at all. Teddy gets a call from Dan the next day and she informs him that she still can't find any human remains from the explosion, just metal parts and gears. Dan and Ellie then visit the factory to learn more about her father. They run into the Kupfer family, who are there for a special tour because he's the best-selling silver shamrock person in the country. They're greeted by Colonel Cochran himself to cheers and laughter and having a good old time. And it's here you really get to see the range of the big baddie. He's a little Bond villainish in this movie, but I think that makes it even more unique. You'll find that he can change his demeanor on the dime, from friendly to cocky to sinister, but he always has this calm and cool approach to it all. During the tour, Buddy Jr. is being his bratty self, wanting to mask from Cochran. Cochran then gives him one that he claims has already been through final processing, which stumps Buddy as to what it could possibly be for a cheap-ass mask. Cochran gets a little more cheeky when it comes to explaining what it means and won't let anyone behind that non-discreet door over there with this sign so big Stevie Wonder could read it. On their way out of the factory, Ellie notices their dad's car underneath a tarp, but before she can reach it, the suited goons stop her. Way to make a scene, Ellie. If that doesn't tip anyone off, nothing will. Back at the motel, Dan is off the titty and back on the hooch when he decides to run to the manager's office to use the phone. The phones are down, however, and when he runs back to the room, he notices Ellie is gone. He looks out the window and notices several suited goons standing in line outside. He decides he's way too old for that shit, so he sneaks out of the back and takes off. He makes his way back to the factory and sneaks in. After a bit of investigating, he stumbles into a small room where a creepy-looking old lady is knitting away. When he tries to ask what they did with Ellie and he starts shaking her, her damn head falls off. He's shocked to find out that she's just a robot, and while he's distracted, Dick the Warlock turned Dick the Enforcer grabs him from behind and tosses him over a table. After a brief fight, Dan manages to get the upper hand and punches him right in the gut. After a couple hits, he punches right through his stomach and starts pulling out wires as goo comes from the Dickster's mouth. Turns out Dick the Enforcer was Dick the Android the whole time, as well as all the other suited goons. Cochran shows up with some more goons and explains the android shit away quickly before taking him to the final processing area. It's finally Halloween, and in true Bond villain fashion, Cochran starts revealing his secrets behind Silver Shamrock novelty. It's also here where we see the missing Stonehenge piece that was mentioned in the beginning during the news report. He also explains that shit away quickly with some cheeky lines and never really explains how they got it into Santa Mira in the first place.
We had a time getting it here. You wouldn't believe how we did it.
Okay, I guess. He says that Stonehenge is what was powering those nifty tags on the back of the masks that killed Marge Gutman, and he wants to show Dan what a true demonstration is going to look like. They tune into the TV screen as goons bring the Kupfer family into a room set up like a bomb shelter test room. With some classic 80s computer beeps and boops, he rolls that beautiful bean footage and we start getting flashes on the TV screen as well as the tag on the back of little Buddy's mask. In just a second, Buddy Jr.'s mask starts to rotten and his head turns to mush as he collapses. Bugs and snakes start coming out of his head and shit, and yep, they killed a kid. They did it.
You crazy son of a bitch, you did.
After seeing that shocking and gruesome shit, Betty dies apparently from fainting, and Buddy Sr. gets bitten by the rattlesnake that came out of Junior's head. Cochran looks pleased with himself as Dan looks on in terror. Later, we get a scene showing the commercial and tons of kids rushing to the store to pick up these masks. As they head out to trick-or-treat, we see a shit ton of kids with the same 3 masks, some with their own personal spin on their costumes. If you ask me, I wouldn't want to have the same mask as a million other kids, but whatever. We then see Teddy tinkering with the parts from the wreckage and trying to get a hold of Dan. One of the androids sneaks in and takes her out with a power drill. Oh, poor Teddy. I always hated this for a character, but at the same time, why not show it? You've been pretty brutal so far, but now you're going to hold out on us? It's now nighttime already on Halloween, and Cochran has Dan tied up in a chair. He delivers a kick-ass bad guy monologue here, and you'll find out it's much more than just a pod movie. It's a witchcraft movie too. He ties in the festival of Samhain and how the planets are all aligned for this special sacrifice before wishing Dan a happy Halloween. It's a goofy premise, but it's unique just the same. He puts on the original Halloween so we can hear some of that classic score again, and then he leaves the room. Dan manages to reach the TV and kicks the screen out. Using the glass shards, he cuts his restraints and makes this unbelievable throw with his mask to cover up the camera before escaping through the vent. He finds a phone and tries to call and warn his ex-wife, but she's still rightfully pissed off about earlier and blows him off. You might have just sealed your kid's own fate for some Poonie, Dan. I mean, hey, he's not perfect, so I can't be too hard on him. Speaking of Poonie, he finds Ellie strapped to a table in another room and breaks her out. They make their way back into the Stonehenge room where he finds boxes of tags. He manages to sneak in and turn the commercial on without anyone noticing and heads to the catwalk above with a box of tags. He dumps the tags over the rail as the commercial plays, triggering the Stonehenge and demise of all the workers and goons below. Cochran, realizing what happens, looks up with that cool demeanor of his and applauds him for a job well done. It also, in some fashion, triggers Stonehenge and that circle of computers to send some kind of beam of light into Cochran, turning him into what looks like a clay figure or something as he pulls a Houdini and disappears, thus killing him. With Cochran now dead, Dan and Ellie run out of the factory as everything explodes and sets fire. They find a car and head out of town to try and stop the commercial from still airing. It's at this point that we notice, along with Dan, that Ellie suddenly has no liveliness about her and she actually hasn't said a word since he rescued her. Ellie then grabs Dan in the face, causing him to hit a tree. He notices her detached arm hanging from the door covered in green goo, and just like that, Ellie's a fembot.
Machine gun jubblies? How did I miss those, baby?
To be honest, it's not really explained if she was an android the whole time or if she was actually killed or not before being replaced by an android. I can't really say for sure, but I like to think she was just kidnapped from the motel and then replaced. Either way, Dan takes out android Ellie after a brief struggle and runs off. Dan manages to make it to that friendly gas attendant station, even though he tried to remove himself from this wacky shit earlier, and calls the TV company or something to convince them to cut the feed. You know, back when there were only 3 channels and not 300. After some screaming and begging, he manages to get them to cut the feed off the first 2, but can't convince them to get the 3rd one off as he screams into the camera.
Stop it! Stop it! Stop it!
And that was Halloween 3 Season of the Witch. And that's really the way they ended it too, with the potential death of millions of kids. You know, like so many, I was stuck in this mindset of fuck this movie for so long. I always heard how bad it supposedly was. You know, it did have Michael Myers in it. I did attempt to watch it when it came on TV when I was younger, not knowing anything about it. Just randomly came on one day and I was waiting for Michael and he never showed, so I turned it off and I said piss on it. I'm telling you all of this now so I can also tell you to knock that shit off. It's almost cliche at this point, and it's really unfair to this movie. It's wild and it certainly isn't perfect, but after you really sit down and think about this movie, it's so much more. There's so much more to it. I mean, it has Carpenter's fingerprints all over, you know, between the style, the atmosphere, the score. The old crew is here. You can really feel it. Dean Cundey, you can feel it. It really brings this movie to the next level. I dare you to find a movie that's just like this or that has the same kind of charm, because it just doesn't exist as far as I know. In the style, the story, everything, it's truly unique, for good or bad. And honestly, because of that, I think that's the biggest reason why this movie has finally come into its own 40 years later. I give Halloween 3 Season of the Witch a 3.5 out of 5. And anyone who likes classic horror movies, I highly recommend this movie. And if you were like me beforehand and you just said fuck it because no Michael Myers, change that attitude, go into it with a different set of eyes, a different mindset, and try it again. I promise you, cheesy or not, it's a great film. And I think you'll enjoy it if you just give it a chance. Tommy Lee Wallace and the crew did a great job here, and they deserve all the love in the world that they didn't get back then. So now that our favorite bastard movie is out of the way, we're going to get to dive into what people really wanted in 1982, but didn't get until 1988, the year of my birth. As we all know, Dr. Loomis's and Michael's story is far from over, and next time I'll be covering Halloween 4, The Return of Michael Myers, a fairly strong outing from our favorite boogeyman, I might add. But until then, let's toast to Dr. Dan Chalice, and I'll see you next time.